Thank you, Alaska Hirlig, and would like to welcome the Minister of State to the House. Genuinely to do that, but in doing so, I think it is a pity. Presumably, the Minister for Finance has other commitments, and that's, of course, we all understand that he has other commitments. And presumably, he had a commitment at 11:30, which may be the real reason why we started this debate at 10:30 today rather than 11:30. And maybe if we had been told that earlier in the week by the leader, you know, everybody could actually understand and accept a commitment that was there, rather than having that ridiculous skirmish the other day in relation to the order of business this morning. I think an element of honesty actually might be forthcoming from the leader in future in relation to the arrangements in this House, and a little more courtesy to the opposition leaders, and indeed all of the leaders in the House. And I think it is a pity that the Minister for Finance in this important debate hasn't had the opportunity. I don't criticise him personally, but hasn't had the opportunity to hear the contributions of all of the party leaders in this House in relation to this important debate. I don't for a moment diminish the importance and contribution of the Minister of State who's in the House today. And I think it's interesting when Senator Boyle says there should be a degree of honesty and so on in relation to this debate. Of course, he's absolutely right. And one of the things that we need to do in order to understand where we are at the moment and where we're going is to understand what's actually happened. And Senator Boyle and others used the word sudden, that we've had this sudden downturn this year. Now, I, for one, don't accept that the government and its advisers could not see some changes occurring in the Irish economy in the months, even the years, but certainly in the months prior to those so-called sudden changes actually occurring. I simply don't believe it, Alaska Hirlig. And I remain to be convinced that the Minister, for example, for Finance, the Taoiseach, the current Taoiseach, and previous Minister for Finance, when he said almost exactly only a year ago, in November last, when he said that, when he made his Indicon speech, and when he said, and I quote, "It is wonderful to realise that there is a new generation in Ireland which has never faced the hardship of high levels of unemployment, or the horrors of weekly riots and bombs in Northern Ireland, or the bleak depression of forced emigration," unquote. Then when he made that general introductory remark to that speech, that he didn't know, or if I can put it another way, that either he did or he ought to have known. Either the Minister knew, either the government knew or ought to have known that there were dramatic changes coming in relation to the economy, and in particular in respect of what occurred in the construction sector, which even the government accepts is at least partly responsible for this so-called sudden downturn this year. So I wonder if the Minister of State can assist me in that, as to whether he maintains the position, or government still maintains the position, that it knew nothing of these impending problems, knew nothing of the prospects that were facing us in 2008, at the very end of 2007 last year. Because I just, for one, don't believe it. Because I have a very high level of trust and confidence in the senior economic advisers to the government and to the Minister for Finance, the civil servants and those who advise the government. And I think the Irish people need a little bit more candour from the government as to, in the words of the old movie, the Richard Nixon film, what did the President know and when did he know it? Because it isn't credible to suggest that this suddenly happened in June of last year. It just simply isn't credible. And I, for one, don't believe it. And if we're to have the kind of debate that Senator Boyle wants to have, the honesty, I think we need an answer to that question. And we need an answer, and further, and this is clearly a political question, because anything to do with the economy is a political question. I say, and I've said it in this House before, that there must come a day of reckoning, political day of reckoning, for all of those in the government, Fianna Fáil and PD in particular, whose, from what one could see in terms of their ideas and their economic planning or sense of where the economy was going in the past 5, 6, 7 years, thought that all they had to do was simply to ensure that the property pumps were primed, and that practically every concession looked for, tax concession looked for from the property sector was granted, When they complained about legitimate social measures, for example, in the Planning Acts in respect of affordable housing, they came in and quickly got concessions in relation to that. That the government's idea of economic planning was a very was reduced essentially to what they could do for the property sector. And now we're bearing the fruits of that. And this, if I may say so, Mr. McCreevy has often described Alaska Hirlik as a great genius and the architect, or one of the architects of our economic success. And he has said, and apparently has recently stood over having said, when I have money I spend it, when I don't, I can't, or something along those lines. Surely, Alaska Hirlik, and I asked the Minister, that is a deeply economically illiterate observation. Because part of the role of government is not just to maintain the economy and keep the books straight, but it's to look to the future. And look to the future of those people that the Taoiseach was able to refer to last year as now apparently being part of a generation which has never faced the hardships of high rates of unemployment or the bleak depression of forced emigration. What's in store for that generation now? What's now in store for a generation, a whole generation of young people in their 20s, 30s and beyond who have been educated in this country, who are in a generation of people, perhaps the first in many generations to be educated here with a prospect of being able to stay here, work here and live here. What's now in prospect for them? And it simply isn't, it just simply is not acceptable for this government to say and to suggest as they do that what has happened in the last year is something that has been brought into this country in some way by some kind of international airborne disease that's arrived in Ireland that we've caught. As if there's no agency associated with government action at all. As if the government is simply there, as I say, to do the books. There are very, very outstanding civil servants in this country. They can do the books. What are politicians for? Where's Mr. Lamass and where's the legacy of Mr. Lamass gone in the Fianna Fáil party? Where at least in his generation people were urged to look to the future and look with vision to the future as to how the economy and how the country would be in generations to come. We're not getting any of that. This speech of the ministers today is sadly lacking, lamentably lacking, in any vision for the future of the country. He describes the problem paragraph after paragraph, page after. We can all describe the problem. Any of us can sit down and write an essay as to how bad things are. But what we're looking for, and the reason we sought this debate every day for the last 3 weeks, was that we were hoping that the Minister and the Government would come into this House and set out some elements of a vision for the future, some elements of a plan. But that is not what they have done. And I ask again, what is the point of politics? What is the point of politicians? What is the point of governments elected by the people to bring forward solutions? They may not always be acceptable to the people, but bring forward suggestions, bring forward ideas and bring forward a vision. Nothing. The obsession, and I don't say that the public finances and addressing the public finances isn't a critical concern. Absolutely, of course it is. I feel I almost have to make the point. I can't say it goes without saying, but of course it is vitally important. But it's only half the picture. It's only one element of the picture. But even the way the Minister characterises that in his speech, it's telling, very telling. Because what does he say about that? He says the first priority is to bring our finances under control. And he says, quote, we have to prove to those who have invested here and who are continuing to invest here that we can manage our way out of this severe downturn, unquote. This is again the kind of language, the sort of language that in fact portrays this country almost as if there's no self-confidence associated with that sort of language and that sort of approach. None at all. That the whole priority is, and what we have to do, prove to others. Now, of course, I'm quite sure that prospective investors in Ireland, they look in and they see, well, how are they managing their public finances? I take that for granted. Of course, that's important. But it betrays an attitude and it betrays a complete lack of any kind of a positive approach to why and how we might pull our economy up and plan for our future, and it simply characterises it as we need to behave and we need to be seen to behave. And this notion then about a stimulus, I saw the Minister of State on the media in the last few days when a member of my party was repeating and canvassing again the proposals that we have set out in very considerable detail. And nobody say that the Labour Party hasn't set out in detail. By all means scrutinise it and criticise it, and let's have it as part of the debate. And I heard Senator Boyle on another occasion saying that it was Keynesianism, when every other country in the world is turning back to Keynesianism. And he was speaking about it in a pejorative sense, that we were engaging in Keynesianism because we dared to speak about the necessity to have a stimulus programme in the economy. Now, I thought the Minister of State on the television said that he disagreed with that. I understood him to say that he disagreed with it. But this week, and he can clarify that, but this week apparently the new line from the government, and it's a new line because this is the first week we've heard it, we already have a stimulus, is the new line. Like the week before that, we didn't need it, or it was wrong, or wasn't prudent, or it wasn't the way forward, or Labour Party was talking through its hat. This week it appears to be, yes, we do need a stimulus, but you know what? We already have one. So which is it? Which is it? And it is not credible, in fact, and not sustainable for the government to point to actions that it has already been taking. The National Development Plan, the important and welcome investments in public infrastructure that the government has been able to engage in recent years, to say that that's a stimulus programme. I mean, the whole point of a stimulus programme, if you look at anywhere else in the world, is that we want to add value to what we're doing. We want to actually to ensure that we do something new, we do something additional in order to stimulate or to kickstart the economy. And to rely on something that you're already doing and to try to characterise that as your answer to the point about a stimulus is simply not sustainable. Now, can I just say, by the way, because I heard Senator McSharry making the point about the Labour Party and the public sector and so on. I do agree that there's an element of demonisation of the public service in some of the debate in recent weeks. I want to put that on record. But you know, I would be as critical of the government in this regard for the following reason, because there's a lot of double talk and double speak that comes from the government. On the one hand, they make the rhetorical point that it's wrong to attack the public service. It's wrong to do that, and public service is an important part of our economy and
1 minute left.
And so on. But then the Minister in his speech talks about public servants having a protected status. I understand what he means by that. And he talks about changes that are required to be made. And I have no problem about changes requiring to be made or having the need to have a responsive public service. But presumably any of these changes that the Minister would now advocate or would now canvass were changes that ought to have been made prior to this. Like, I don't actually accept, even though I'm very critical of the government on many issues, but I don't really see evidence in recent years that the government was appointing whole rafts of new people in the public service unnecessarily, or that they didn't have a job to do, or there weren't legitimate services there to be provided, or that they were prepared to stand over waste, or that they were prepared to stand over staffing. So is this something new now that the government has decided that it's necessary to do this? I would have thought that if many of these changes that it is said are now required were changes that should have been made all along, or if there was waste, the waste should never have occurred, in good times or bad. So to invoke the downturn as a reason for making these changes, it seems to me just a little questionable. And I do, again, I think, wish to reiterate and point out again, as has been pointed out across the board, that the OECD report, whilst not giving the Irish public service anything that you could say was an absolute clean bill of health, certainly has pointed out that despite our economic advances in recent years, we have one of the smallest, if not the smallest, public services as a proportion of our economy of any of the OECD countries. So the public service, it seems to me, performs relatively well in the context of many of the other things that are occurring. And you know, I'm tempted to say that the one element of the public service that hasn't actually performed to par is the government itself. Is the government itself, not the people who serve it so loyally across the board. Can I just finish on the question of the banks? Because again, it's not clear to me what, if any, plan the government has in relation to the banks. It goes from one to the other. It was, and we know back in the summer, we were told that there was told by the banks that there was no difficulty in relation to their liquidity or capital level. Then we came into the autumn and it appeared, I think it was the Taoiseach who said, perhaps in an unguarded moment, that we had to have the guarantee in order to save the banks from collapse. I'm pretty certain that was the word she used, or words to that effect. So it was to save the banks from collapse. But I understood it was also, and that the principal objective behind the guarantee was to ensure that the banks, as a vital motor of the economy, would be there to lend to people. But the collapse in lending, or the very dramatic falling off in lending that we've seen, is still there. So it's no use, Senator O'Toole, to say, oh, well, I wouldn't recapitalise the banks because they won't lend. We rely on the guarantee. The guarantee hasn't achieved that. And there's an interesting point made this morning in the newspapers by one commentator, where he queries, in fact, the recent report that again suggests that there's no difficulty in racial liquidity or capital level in the banks. But still the Minister is continuing to meet with the banks. So the Minister obviously believes that there is a problem and that there is a difficulty. So are we to believe the report that says there's no difficulty of liquidity or no difficulty of capitalisation of the banks? Are we to believe it? Because we've been told other things in the last 3 or 4 months that turned out to be manifestly false. So what is the position in relation to the banks? What is the plan? And is there a plan at all in relation to the banks?